I'm Hester Louise Gates Morgan. I am the daughter of Jakey Wiley Gates, and a first cousin of Frank Ben Gates. One day, while browsing through a bookstore in Denver, I came across a book titled Remembrances of the Men in Gray. As you can imagine, I was quite surprised when I turned a page and found a letter from my uncle, Cary Allen Gates, written while he was serving as a Confederate soldier. I found myself needing to know if there were more things about my family and our story that I could uncover, so I began a search that ended in 1959, when I compiled all of the stories and research I had gathered into a binder I titled, The Eppes Gates Family. It begins with a will of William Gates written in 1750. William would be survived by 5 of his 6 children, and his wife, Susannah Eppes, a 2-time great-granddaughter of Sir Francis Eppes who arrived in the Jamestown colony in the early 1620s, to become an influential leader in the advancement of the colony. Through their son, Edward Elijah Gates, and his wife Rebecca, William and Susannah had a grandson, named Eppes. In 1804, when Eppes was in his early 20s and still living in Virginia, Eppes married Patience Robertson. The Robertson and Gates families had some history, as the grandmother of Patience was Jane Gates, a relative. Jane was married to the Reverend George Robertson. These families both endured the Revolutionary War. The Robertson family is on record for supplying beef to the revolutionaries. This fact has become the portal to our family star/SAR eligibility.
From letters to Hester in the book. Patience Robertson Gates was a little woman. She could spin thread, weave cloth, and make suits of clothes for her father, brothers, and sisters. She learned to knit after she got her second sight. Her last days were spent in the home of her youngest son, James Robertson Gates. She lived to be 92 years of age. My grandmother Gates' maiden name was Robertson. I last saw her when she was around 90 years of age. This was in the year of 1855. This would agree with the only incident in her young life which I now recall. During the Revolutionary War, General Washington's army suffered many hardships with which history has made us familiar. Near the close of the war, the army in Virginia was in dire straits for the lack of saltpeter. When 20 young girls and young women made them bags and volunteered to make their way on foot through the Tory lines to some salt works to obtain a supply. My grandmother Patience was a member of this patriotic company, which carried the enterprise to success, relieving the patriotic army from a serious situation.
They lived about 40 miles south of Richmond, Virginia, in Chesterfield County on a farm where 4 of their children were born. The oldest, Rebecca, was born sometime in 1805, followed by George Robertson Gates, born March 22, 1806. Edward Eppes Gates was born in 1807, and on March 10, 1909, their youngest daughter, Martha Patience Gates, was born.
6 months after the birth of their youngest daughter, Martha, in the month of September, the little family left their Virginia home for New Land in Kentucky. It is said that Patience carried her baby in her arms as they forded the James River on horses near Richmond, and headed over the mountains, hills, and streams to what was to be their new El Dorado in Kentucky. They found a place on Walnut Meadow Creek near Paint Lick, in Girard County, within a stone's throw of Madison County, where they built a farm and a home.
There were quite a few folks named Robertson that ended up in Madison County, in the early 1800s. It was not long before the entire James Robertson family was there. Edward Gates, the father of Eppes, also recorded his will in Kentucky. It would seem that the family thrived in Kentucky until the year 1815, when Eppes was drafted into the War of 1812, while Patience was pregnant with her 5th child.
Sadly, of the 2 mentioned events, only one would come to fruition.
In 1815, Eppes Gates, grandson of William Gates, and Susannah Eppes Gates, husband of Patience Robertson Gates, and their 4 children, died before he could report for duty. Ironically, had he lived, he would never have needed to serve, as the war ended that year. His death occurred shortly before the birth of his youngest son in September of that year. He left his Patience, widowed with 5 children, one being the infant, James. Patience probably had some help from her Robertson family in keeping the farm going after Eppes died. Her youngest child, James, would ultimately inherit the farm in 1857 when Patience died, and he cared for her until her death. By then, James had his own farm within shouting distance of the old Gates farm, on Walnut Meadow Creek near Paint Lick. The only story handed down of Eppes Gates comes from a daughter of Carrie Allen Gates, whose letter Hester found in the bookstore. This daughter simply recalls Carrie Allen speaking of two brothers of Eppes Gates, Daniel and Jacob. There is a will recorded in Girard County, Kentucky for Edward Gates, the father of Eppes. The will was probated in 1919, 4 years after the death of Eppes. The will mentions a son William, namesake of Edward's father, as well as a daughter Lucy and another son Jacob. Edward left his estate to the heirs of his son Eppes. His son Jacob was appointed executor of the will. Jacob may have lived in Kentucky as well. The will of Patience's father James Robertson was dated November 12, 1822 and executed in Madison County the following January, with Patience as executor.
November 12, 1822. Item 1. In the name of God, Amen. I, James Robertson, of Madison County and State of Kentucky, being in low state of health and consider that I might shortly resign this mortal body to dust, and being of sound mind and in perfect senses and judgment, do make this my last will and testament. Item 2. Inasmuch as I have heretofore given my eldest son, James Robertson, one Negro boy by the name of Jeremiah, and Thomas Robertson one Negro by the name of Arthur, and to my daughter Elizabeth Herna, one Negro girl by the name of Prudence, I consider that I have given them their full part of and portion of my estate. Item 4. It is my will and desire that Sarah, my Negro woman, shall be free at my death to act and do for herself, according to her own pleasure forever. I give and bequeath me aid Sarah one cotton spinning wheel and one bed quilt to be her property forever. Item 5. I give and bequeath Caroline, a Negro woman, to my daughter Patience Gates and her heirs forever. Item 6. I give and bequeath to my daughter Phoebe Bailey and her heirs a Negro woman by the name of David. Item 7. I give and bequeath to my son, Henry Robertson, and his heirs forever, one Negro man by the name of Barth.
And if God had been good to someone in those days, they would often need easily recognizable and unable to escape unpaid laborers to work the immense fields of their plantations and keep the white pillars of their mansions nice and shiny. Their herds of slaves were among their biggest assets. Glory be to God for their good fortune. I find it curious that Archer, Jeremiah, Charles, Prudence, Sarah, Caroline, David, and Barth were most likely encouraged to give glory to the God that deemed them less than worthy. Glory most certainly did not belong to Archer, Jeremiah, Charles, Prudence, Sarah, Caroline, David, and Barth, who, like the milk cows, only had a first name. Ironically, our Gates ancestors, who did so many good things in their communities and for our nation, who valued the memory of the Eppes family by naming their children Eppes, would take every measure to isolate souls like Archer, Jeremiah, Charles, Prudence, Sarah, Caroline, David, and Barth from their own heritage and the future of their families. It is impossible to reconcile this horrendous act with the wholesome story of a family who, through the generations, remained upstanding in their communities. It is a stain that will remain forever on what wants so badly to be a source of pride.
The plantation home of Hopewell, built by Francis Eppes on the Appomattox River in 1635, would be rebuilt in 1751 by a descendant, Dr. Richard Eppes, and renamed Appomattox Manor. Dr. Eppes owned a total of 3 plantations, all operating on slave labor. Between the early 1600s and 1804, when the slave trade was abolished due to cruelty, 12.5 million Africans had been transported to the original British colonies. 2.5 million Africans died of horrendous circumstances during those voyages. By the time the trade was abolished, enslaved people in the antebellum South represented 1/3 of the population, and the breeding of these people was encouraged, often if the sire was the plantation master. There were laws put in place to keep any person with the slightest measure of African blood captive. The invention of the cotton gin made slaves a more precious commodity. There was a persistent unease over the predicament, as slave rebellions popped up here and there, only to be viciously squashed. All of this left good men wrestling, with the lies they were telling themselves to keep it all going. One of those men was Dr. Richard Eppes. He wrote what he called a system of management, which was a code of laws for slavery. It was put into a document curiously called In the Light of Human Beings. Not all slave owners were convinced that their Africans were human. In April 1865, President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses Grant smoked cigars on the veranda of Appomattox Manor as they discussed the terms of General Lee's Confederate Army surrender. The agreement was signed at Appomattox Courthouse. In 1960, the Eppes family donated Appomattox Manor as a national park. When the arrangement was made, the property had become the longest held by a single family in American history.